few minutes just to let the room populate, see a number of attendees joining. Welcome everyone. I see people are starting to populate now. Welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today as we kick off the first of our Prospectus grant series events. Prospectus has been running similar events throughout the years on leadership, fundraising and HR, and we wanted to take the opportunity to utilise our track record and expertise in supporting trusts, foundations and grant makers to launch a new series of events. This also complements our internal grants collective forum, which shares market intelligence and best practice on our recruitment of roles at all levels for funders across the UK and internationally. I'm joined today by an exciting panel of speakers as we explore place-based funding, the power dynamics and the potential it has for long-term change. Before we start, I just wanted to mention we have about 90 attendees signed up today, and we will be collecting questions throughout the session. There is a Q&A box at the bottom. Please do send those through. And we'll make sure to get those asked at the end. And please do highlight any questions if it's for the panel or for a specific panel member. My name is Matt Till. I'm a team leader at Prospectus, and I'm joined here today by Dinah Cox, Chair of Trustees at Devon Community Foundation, with previous experience as Associate Director at the now City Bridge Foundation, Paul Carbury, CEO of the Smallwood Trust, and Doran, place lead at Lankelly Chase. To kick things off and to start things off, I wanted to keep it quite simple. It would be great to hear an outline from the panel about your organisation's place-based experience or place-based work you do and how it has evolved over time. Dinah, as you work for Devon Community Foundation and is focused on a wide and dynamic geographical area, I thought it might be great to start with yourself. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the work you do.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'd be very happy to talk about Devon, my adopted home county. Devon Community Foundation started in 1996, which was the year my child was born as well. And last year, we gave away around £1 million in grants. The average grant was about £6,000. And since 96, we've given away about 20 million. As a community foundation, we have an endowment. Our endowment's about 10 million, and we use that to reduce funds that we give away in grants. But we also work with individuals who want to donate, our philanthropists, to get their money out to the communities that need it. And we've also been working with statutory sector partners and other funders to ensure that our money is spent wisely with those who need it. So to think about how we do that, just briefly, there would be two things I'd mention at the beginning. The first one is that we have a community engagement insight function. So we make sure that we're listening to what people have to say and that we understand what's going on across Devon. Because with the population of 800,000, there's a lot of different communities that make up the Devon community, and we want to know what it is they think, what do they want, what do they need. So we have Nicola, our impact, insight and learning person, and she heads up that team, scoping for issues that impact on people in Devon, and also making sure we understand the voluntary and community sector that serves them. And then the other element I'd mention to start off with is our partnerships. None of this work can be done without partners. When I was at City Bridge Foundation, I will probably call it Trust, I don't know how many times today, Paul's organisation and my organisation, for instance, worked together to get a grant scheme up and running for women's groups, which are in desperate need. Here in Devon, we work with the wider voluntary and community infrastructure. As mentioned, we work with the philanthropists who are already engaged and those who are considering giving in the county. We have other stakeholders such as the local authorities and national funders that we work with. And we also work with the UKCF, absolutely brilliant team there. So working with other community foundations so we can support each other as part of that partnership. And then one extra one, after saying I'd only do two, I think is we need to understand with a place that a place is made up of several communities. When I was young, about 20 years ago, it would have been called communities of place and communities of interests. For us at Devon Community Foundation, equality is so important because different communities are facing different challenges and we want to make sure we're reaching all our communities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight into the work that you've been delivering at Devon and beyond. Joe, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the work that you do, whereas Dinah's geographically locked to one place. You work across different regions, don't you?
Yeah, cheers, Matt. Cheers, Dana. Yeah, so Lankelly Chase, very briefly, is a 60-year-old private endowed foundation. Broadly, our work falls into sort of two camps. There's a sort of a thematic camp of inquiries, which is, around sort of governance and knowledge and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the place-based work. And the place-based work, there are 5 places which Lankelly Chase works in, and this is part of the problem, is that we call them our places. Our 5 places spread around the country, but they're sort of geographically bound by sort of local authority boundaries rather than bioregion boundaries or anything else like that, which shows the sort of entry point we had into those places. They weren't sort of picked from a sort of a list of anything. They were just places where stuff was happening a little bit, that maybe around sort of systems change. We went where the energy was, but we went where the energy was in terms of a sort of local authority focused systems change. Our work now has sort of molted that or shed that skin and is quite different. But because of the spread around the country of where we work, we get a great amount of insight from those different places, and we're able to facilitate those places linking up a bit more and sharing their own insights and working more in solidarity together, which has been a great focus over the last year or so.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's the insights that can be shared between places is fascinating. Paul, tell us a little bit more about the Smallwood Trust. I feel from our conversations before this event, it's fairly a recent endeavour for yourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Hello to everyone. So we've actually the oldest of the panel members are trustees, but maybe not of everyone who's come along to this webinar today. So we've been going for 137 years, I've just worked out, and our mission is to enable women to be financially resilient. More recently, we've been talking about reducing gendered poverty. Our history is really interesting. We used to be called the Society for the Assistance of Ladies in Reduced Circumstances. So to a degree, you can imagine, the journey that we've been on, which has certainly accelerated in the last 6 or 7 years. But originally, and until about 6 or 7 years ago, our primarily focus was giving small grants to individuals of about £500. So what would normally be termed a sort of hardship type grants. And over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, we've been doing quite a lot of thinking about how we can increase our impact. And we're a national funder as well. And so we have about a third, well, it has gone down quite a lot over the last sort of year or so, but we have about £30 million portfolio of investments. Some of that is a permanent endowment, some of that's expendable. So we've been thinking very sort of hard about how we can be more effective with our funding. And so about 5 years ago or so, we invested in what we called then a partnership project in Coventry, which was 5 or 6 local women's organisations who had been working together informally, but came together to apply for this funding that we'd made available to basically strengthen the referral partnerships and the networks between those 5 organisations who already worked together. And that was all about improving economic outcomes. And so we didn't even think of that as a place-based initiative. We were thinking that as a partnership initiative. But that led on to into an evolution of us thinking more clearly about place, and also developing our thinking around, so from going from grants to individuals, which is very much about responding to an immediate need, to thinking about, well, what more could we do on a longer term basis that might actually challenge the systems and processes that keep women in poverty. So that's kind of the whole thinking that was going on, and is still very much a live discussion in our organisation today. So we've been working in Coventry for 5 years, but it's only just now that they're starting to think about the system and what challenges need to be put in place or influencing in place in the local area, because it didn't start off on that basis. So that's been quite an interesting experience. But using that, we've then been more, that experience in Coventry, we've been more intentional in funding in other places as well. But every one is quite different. So we're supporting a network in Birmingham who are working with women with no recourse to public funds. That's a very challenging environment. There's about 7 organisations in that partnership. Again, that's a citywide one, really, like Coventry. In Manchester, we're supporting a coalition of grassroots community organisations in Wythenshawe, which also has the Housing Association involved in that, who are probably the biggest organisation by far. And that's a real grassroots anti-poverty network, and where the community is in the lead in terms of deciding on everything that happens in that programme. About 18 months ago or so, we started working in a single ward in Middlesbrough to design a grants to individuals programme with local women there, and we've now done a pilot there, and that's going to be carrying on for the next 3 years. And so we're not experts in this at all. Our approach is evolving all the time, and it's lots of different places, lots of different challenges, so it's all quite different. But obviously there's a strength in that as well. So a couple of the other things I think just initially to point out, which we found really helpful, and as Dinah said earlier, we're a small to medium sized funder, so we are taking money out of our capital as well to add to the investment income and any external funds we work in partnership with. So for the next sort of 3 years, we'll be awarding about £3.5 million a year. But I would say about 50% of that is still on immediate needs, and about 50% is on this place-based sort of longer term approach in general. But running alongside that, we've appointed an external learning partner who are helping us understand what's going on in all those places, and also for us internally to learn and sort of adapt and test and learn. So we've been very much trying things out and then adapting as we go along. So our funding has had to be totally flexible, on that kind of basis. And we've also been working and collaborating with other funders as well, so there's no way that we could have done the extended reach in the way that we have done without working with our funding partners as well. That's been integral, and it's also been really good because we've shared all of our internal processes and sort of gently challenged each other along the way as well. So that's all been really useful, and we're just about to launch in a couple of new places for us anyway, in Hackney and Newham with London, and that's with the City Bridge Foundation.
Well, thank you so much to the panel for the overviews of that work. I think it's interesting to see established organisations, people stepping into this area for the first time as well. So working across these varying and different regions requires a lot of local knowledge. And when it comes to place-based funding, I imagine it is essential to bring the voices of those that you're funding into the conversation, and it's crucial for the success and impact of that funding too. To explore that, I wanted to look at power dynamics within the work and within your work, and how you engage with local knowledge and build collaborative and impactful partnerships with communities. So Paul, tell us a little bit about the importance of power dynamics when designing your place-based funding programs.
Yeah, excuse me. So that obviously is one of the most important things. And I'll give you a few examples, but before we get into that, I think we've had lots of discussions internally that I think probably a lot of us have had about shifting power, what that means for us as an organisation, what that means for the grant making sector as a whole, because I think it's quite fair to say, isn't it, that traditionally speaking, grant makers, this might be maybe a bit of a generalisation, but have been quite top down often in how they distribute funding. So certainly for us at Smallwood, it's been, again, a real learning journey in terms of how we've evolved ourselves in order then to understand how best to, you know, work with local communities. And so it's all kind of knits together. So one of the practical things that we've done recently, which has really helped, I think, is this is not with the places, but internally, in terms of our own governance, we've established a board shadowing program where women with lived experience shadow and participate in our board meetings and various other governance meetings that we have as an organisation. And that's really helped centre some of that lived experience at that governance level, which is then led on to further conversations about us shifting power and power dynamics and so on, because obviously those dynamics are very real and there. And so, to give you an example, we've been working in Middlesbrough now for about 18 months in one ward there with a couple of local community groups and their service users, and with 2 other funders. And the local community had never heard of any of us, and because of their previous experiences with a lot of institutions, were quite rightly, I think, quite sceptical about what our intentions were in Middlesbrough and why we were even wanting to work in Middlesbrough and so on. And so we've had to work really hard to sort of build that trust over that 18 months, and also, you know, get the funding signed off by our board that we're going to actually be there for the longer term as well, rather than come in and do a pilot program, see what might happen, and then, you know, something never quite happens. And so we were quite conscious about not repeating, you know, the experiences that some members of the local community had with other institutions that, you know, that they'd had dealings with. And so that's been really interesting, and it's taken us, we hadn't foreseen how long building that trust was going to take with the local community. And so that's definitely a learning point for us across all of our other programs as well. One of the other key things, I think, which helped build the trust is that we immediately started funding these 2 local organisations. We just gave them an unrestricted grant. There was no terms and conditions attached to it. We appointed a woman from the local community. That's only just happened just recently, but that's also helped as well in terms of us building the relationships, trying to cement that programme there for the longer term. And the boards of all the organisations were really, you know, quite foresightful, really, in signing off 3-year grant agreements. So the 3 funders, the other 2 funders, have turned to us and Buttle UK, and between us, we've put £1 million in, and that's all been signed off by our boards. So there was no grant applications. There was, you know, we were writing papers to our board, but we did all of that. There's no big evaluation frameworks that the board are approving and so on. So, you know, obviously we've talked in detail, but that approach has been really important, because I think what I've experienced, and maybe even done myself in the past, is that you then end up taking the power dynamics from the board and trying to do that in a local area, because you've got all these decisions and things to overcome. And so I think us changing how we operate internally has helped us be more mindful of the dynamics that we bring, because we still bring those dynamics and our own experiences, don't we, into these situations. And it just, sometimes I think it is a scary place for grant makers to give away that power, isn't it? That's what, that's a reality, I think. I don't know whether that's quite answered your question, Matt, but that was, but we've had to build, I mean, from all of the our experience, it's all been about building collaborative relationships and processes. So not just between us and the communities and the organisations that we might be funding, also with the places where there is 6 or 7 partners working together, trying to facilitate the space so they can all get to know one another better, to build those relationships as well, so they can sort of move forward together as well. So in our first 18 months really of intentionally doing place, there's been lots of conversations, workshops, webinars of sort of building that trust and relationship and collaboration and coordination. That's what the majority of our funding and focus has been on in the first year to 18 months. And I think now we're trying to start looking ahead about the more sort of practical aspects of funding these programs and so on. So that's the other thing. I think we've awarded quite and paid out quite considerable amounts of funding without any concrete actions being reported back to us like you normally would expect. And I think that's been quite different for us as well compared to some of the funding we used to give out in the past.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, the relationships do take that time to build, and that trust does take time to build as well. But it can be a leap of faith that you're going to jump into that type of work. Joe, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about power and funding in Lankelly and the work that you do in your places. Have you experienced similar things to Paul with those, building those relationships taking time? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, very, very similar. Our journey, our board devolved decision making on grants down to the staff team about 5 years ago. So that was part of a loser control thing. It was part of a power shifting thing in the sense as well that they were sitting there going, well, we don't have a mooring into this work that you're bringing to us. We can't make good decisions on it. So we're going to delegate that decision-making authority down to the staff team. And what we've done, especially in our places, is exactly the same thing. We've devolved it further down into those places. So the decision-making on spend in places is done both ends. So both the sort of budget setting and the spend decision-making is done in those places where Lankelly Chase is in a minority of decision makers. And as Paul said, that necessitates a different view of governance. It means that you can't sort of replicate the dynamics of a board and using the same sort of hierarchy of knowledge and impact and all of that sort of stuff. It means something different in a place. That means you need to use sociographic methods and things like that actually sort of that kind of sort of approach. And the way in, there are ways in, we've used participative grant making a lot, not as a sort of end goal, but as a methodology of bringing people into a room. I think that the one of the points Paul was making, I think, it's very important, is that post-impact relationships are what matter. Relationships are what endure and what allow you to find a way forward whenever methodology doesn't work anymore. That's what's still there. The group of people who come together to save a local park, once that's done, they're still in relationship. They've still got their agency. They've still got a greater understanding of how things work. That's the sort of impact you can't measure, and therefore that's the sort of impact that you can't look at when you're making funding decisions. So how you make funding decisions in a sort of collaboration, that's what changes. So there's sort of the power being fluid rather than dynamics looking at being changed. I mean, it's called dynamics. Dynamics changes. It's not static. It's not binary. I think that didn't quite answer your question, but that's where I'm going to draw on it.
I mean, both of you, I want to hear about what you've got to say about power and how it impacts your work and how you work with communities in that power. So you both answered it very well. So thank you for taking the time to talk about that. Dinah, tell me a little bit more about power in the work that you've done in the past.
Well, I just have to say I love what Paul and Joe said. The idea, having worked in voluntary and community sector organisations for most of my career before becoming a funder. To get funding with no application form and no monitoring, whoa, that would have really, really made my day. So I might be stealing that idea and trying to think about how we do that. It's a bit different with the Community Foundation, I think, because of the way we are and how we were set up. So about 50 years ago in America, community foundations were set up because there was a feeling that philanthropists, which is a bigger thing probably in America than here, were really shaping what was happening in communities rather than the communities themselves. So they were set up in order to ensure that communities could shape what happened to them. And I think, as the disability rights activists were saying back in the 90s, nothing about us without us is really key to me as an individual, as a Black woman brought up on council estates in London. It was really obvious to me when people were doing to us, coming onto our estates, not building relationships, not working with us. And that can't continue. You can't have a system that does that if you want equity, if you want a bit more fairness in society. But I think part of the problem that we have as community foundations is we have this multitude of people involved. So we have individual philanthropists who may have particular ideas about how they want to spend their money. We have national donations coming through for things such as COVID. And so there are things attached to that in terms of how we can apply that. And we don't quite have a fund for ladies in reduced circumstances, although I think we ought to, because I really quite like that. We have various pots of money that have things attached to them. So what we're trying to do is move to work with the philanthropists who working with philanthropists who do have that community insight, because there are many out there and we have them in Devon Community Foundation. And then bring on other philanthropists and convene those relationships between those with the access to the finances and those who are on the ground in the communities facing inequality. And how can we make that work? Can we do, as I was saying earlier, more community insight, more understanding of what's going on, as well as that connection? Because what we really want to do is move from transaction to transformation. And that's where we want to be as a community foundation. And we're very lucky, Kerry, our new Chief Executive Officer, Laura and Philippa, who I believe both of them are on this call today, have come in to head up our grants, head up our philanthropy, and make some of those changes that we'll talk about later. But if I could just touch on City Bridge Foundation, and I believe, Geraldine, if you're on the call, please forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, because I stopped working with City Bridge Trust as it was at the beginning of the year. But it was a real privilege to work with Geraldine and some of her team on the Anchor programme. Now, City Bridge Foundation has its money from 1200 and something. It's a very, very old organisation, but only started doing community grant making in the 1990s, giving away approximately 40 million a year compared to Devon's 1 million a year, having community of 8 million compared to 800,000. It's a very different beast. And what we wanted to do when I was there was figure out a way to get long-term core funding into the communities. But being that the people who make the decisions ultimately about grant making are the aldermen of the City of London Corporation, it was how to do that in such a way that community could be involved, but it couldn't be participatory grant making, because the way that the organisation is constituted, that couldn't happen. So we got a team of 25 organisations, tiny organisations, Sisters of Freedom. I just love that organisation. Group of disabled women supporting other disabled women, to organisations such as the Consortium of LGBT+ organisations, getting everybody in a room together, ripping up what we did in terms of our application and all of that, although, as I say, we didn't get to Paul's place of no application, redesigning that, getting that out there, having that advisory group, having 6 weekly meetings to build those relationships that both Joe and Paul have talked about, because that's essential. So we had trust in the room to come up with something different. The first grants have just been made. Each of them are about £1 million of unrestricted funding for 10 years for each of those organisations involved. And I think there's about 7. But Geraldine, if you're on, put in the chat what it really is, because I can't remember. So the power is so important. And in the past, yes, those who have the power to be the great and good. Here am I sitting as chair of Devon Community Foundation. What do I know? I've lived in Devon for 10 years. I haven't lived here all my life. I need to hear the voices of the people in Devon. We need to understand as the Community Foundation what their aspirations are, where they want to be. Our role is to make that as real as possible with the resources at our disposal in partnership with others.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I think how you fund, how you decide what to fund, who's in the room to decide that, there's a lot of commonalities here, and I think that's fantastic to hear, all these, ripping up the rule books and looking at things completely different to redistribute that power. We've got a couple of questions that have come through already. Please do keep them coming through. I want to remind everyone about that question and answer box. We will ask some of those at the end of the session. Finally, this is quite a big philosophical question, but I wanted to explore and ask about the future of place-based funding. We want to leave a lasting impression in these areas and ensure that they can thrive past the funding being delivered. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your organisational ambitions, aspirations, perhaps even the legacy that you hope to leave with your funding decisions. Dinah, what are your thoughts on that?
I wasn't expecting you to come back to me, and I couldn't get the mouse to work to unmute myself. That moment of panic that we have with these digital things, which are worse in rural areas, by the way, but never mind. Equality, equality, equality. That would be what I would say that we're aiming for at Devon Community Foundation as a legacy. As I said just a few moments ago, we're lucky that Kerry, Laura and Philippa, a new team of people working on things, are in the organisation, working with the staff and the trustees who are already there to think about how we do things going forward. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is reviewing our entry level or responsive community grants programs to try and think about how that works. We want to support relevant parts of the voluntary and community sector to make sure that they can do that work to make society more equitable. So one thing we might think about is a city-based equalities network in Plymouth. When I was in London, and one of the projects that's been funded by Geraldine's team at City British Foundation is an organisation called HERE. When I was working in London 25 or whatever years ago, I helped set up HERE, which is a network of different equalities organisations from the protected characteristics plus refugee organisations to see how we could work together. So these things have been going for a while. We just need to make sure that we're supporting them. But we're also looking at funding for specific areas. So health inequality, looking at rural poverty. We had the Bishop of Exeter, who's just stepped down from our board, who spoke beautifully about rural poverty in the House of Lords, if anybody has the chance to hear that. So we're working with Somerset Community Foundation and others to think about the research that needs to be done and work through the issues to tackle rural poverty. One of those issues is digital. I lost my internet connection earlier today and was panicked that I wouldn't be able to make this webinar. And I have no mobile signal. Nobody at this end of my village has any mobile signal because that's the way it goes. If you have the money, you can get around that. You can find a way to do that. But what about the people who don't have a connection, who don't have money, when you have something like COVID and their children can't access learning? We really, really want to bottom out some of these issues. We're also looking at doing a governance review. I've been imposed as chair for 3 years, and it's what I've been looking forward to doing, because as others have said around here, we want more involvement of the community in how DCF is actually run, not just in where the money goes, but how we run the organisation. So we've been working with organisations, getting on board, if anybody's not heard of them, excellent organisation, and will help people look at their trustees and how you make that broader. But we're also looking at task groups, working groups. How can we bring other people in? And I've just managed to recruit a 25-year-old trustee. Yes, I was so delighted. A little bit of youth diversity is very important here. So I think those are the key things. We're doing specific projects around the environment. So we have the joy of calling it Devon on Earth. But what we want to do is bring more funding into that. So talking to potential philanthropists, other people in the field, people that we can work with together to bring a focused fund to green up Devon. And also, I think it's that thing about things being local, national, but also international. So thinking about the social development goals and how we can use that to ensure that what we're doing doesn't just have an impact on our locality, but on the world as a whole, which again, that environmental element does. So finally, from us, I think it's going to be how we communicate some of that. In a forum such as this, where most of us are grant makers or are aware of grant making, it can be quite straightforward. We might get into some of the language that excludes people, should I say. So I think for Devon Community Foundation going forward, because we want to link in with everybody in our county, it's going to be really key about how we communicate with others using plain English, listening to what they have to say and reflecting things back in a way that's not full of jargon and doesn't change every season with whatever the current word for poverty is, just to make sure that people feel included, can have their voices heard.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dinah. Yeah, I think the language thing, it comes up quite a lot. I mean, Paul, when we talked previously, we were talking about language, and you're saying going into those communities and speak to those people. I have no idea what you're talking about. You know, they don't know what language you're using. Paul, what are your thoughts on aspirations and ambitions? I know it's fairly new for you, plus this place-based funding approach, but yeah. What are you thinking here?
I think there's a couple of things. So just to clarify, it's only in our Middlesbrough programme where we haven't had a mad application process. I mean, we've been quite traditional in the past as well, you know, with long application forms and so on. But I think one of the learning and legacies maybe for us at Smallwood is how do we, the approach that we've been taking in Middlesbrough in terms of signing off that funding, how can we embed more of that in our own grant making processes and so on? And that's where I think the learning partners, so we've, rather than a focus on outputs and like an ESF type of model, it's moving more towards what are we learning from all of this place-based work that we're supporting and sort of moving forward from there. So it sort of does require time of the individuals that we're supporting. So yeah, so in terms of legacy, again, the sort of top line, I guess, is, and going back to something that Dinah has mentioned as well, is this thought about building resilient networks within communities is something that's really taken hold within Smallwood, I would say, within the last sort of few years, and that's a key part of our kind of strategic aims. And it's something that Joe mentioned there, that example of a group of people come together to say save the school or the playground, but then are still there, and then they could be motivated enough to move on to other things within their communities. And so we've been trying to create spaces for, you know, networks of people and organizations to come together to talk about their experiences, you know, to share their stories, to get mutual support And sometimes that's, that's the end goal of those meetings. And then from there, trying to build, we've helped facilitate and fund that. And so help build that kind of resilient network for when, obviously, there's a lot of crisis at the moment with the cost of living. So people, the individuals concerned, feel more able to respond to that in the future. Connected to that, our board we've been discussing this morning about how long is long enough in terms of place-based work, and moving beyond the usual sort of 3-year grant making cycle to, should we be funding on a much sort of longer term basis, 5 to 10 years and so on. And that is like a new thought for us, and so that will be something that we'll be looking at over the sort of next few months. I guess one of the things that we have been interested in is, and I guess that kind of plays into our approach, is supporting models of working and seeing whether they can be adapted in other places or in the same places. And so one of the things that our learning partner is going to help with us on our place-based program is to try and identify and articulate those models of working that are taking place within those places, to see whether there's any common threads or not between them. And somehow I'm trying to avoid using the word framework and things like that, but create something that then might be applicable to other places or other networks. And so a lot of our work has been focused on that to date as well. And I think that would be a good legacy to aspire to, I think, would be replicating those sort of effective ways of working, and helping organizations identify what all the good stuff that they're already doing. And that's something that came up in a board meeting this morning as well. We were talking about influencing the system so it changes, so less women are in poverty. And as we all know, a lot of the grassroots organizations are already doing brilliant work already. And so one piece of work is, how do we help them articulate that and sort of bring all that together? Because at the moment it feels quite difficult on a national basis, doesn't it, in terms of getting policy changed and so on and so forth. So there's definitely a piece of work for us there in helping to empower the local organisations that we're supporting to amplify their voice if that's what they want to do, and helping them identify all the really good stuff that's already contributing to sort of system change and challenging processes.
Thank you.
So it's definitely still a work in progress, and we have a whole variety of theory of change work going on as well within all of the places that we're kind of supporting at the moment. One of the things we are going to do at Smallwood as well is be more intentional about sharing what we've been up to and anything that we're learning. But also, I'm very, very keen to learn from what everyone else has been doing. So that's why I think panels like this are really important, because we're sort of no experts, so it's really good to connect with others. And I think we're all on the same road, aren't we, to a lesser or greater degree.
Thanks, Paul. That's really interesting hearing about that. And I suppose, Joe, the choice of the word legacy was probably selected to be aimed at you kind of yourself, with Lankelly looking to spend down. What are your thoughts on legacy of the organisation?
Yeah, cheers. Our road is running out. We're coming to the end of the road, and as such, the question of legacy isn't one for us. Like I think that the legacy of our sort of place-based work is going to have to be defined by the people working in the places. So our posture, our intention over the next couple of years, it's going to look very different depending on what the people like. Creating a networked solidarity movement of radical local actors agitating for change looks very different to a group of people sharing the learning that they've had that's going to come to an end. Like whether those groups and people and places want to continue doing something together or on their own or not at all, is going to define what their legacy needs to be. There's a couple of bits from my point of view. My other half of my job at Lankelly has been sort of running a governance inquiry, which means I've got to, you know, be quite international, and so I've been able to link up, you know, people in Gateshead with sort of Serbian municipalists and all of this sort of stuff, and that sharing that sort of learning has been really, really valuable for me, but for those groups involved. But I think for the sort of the legacy of the people doing the work in place, it's going to be down to them. So we've just agreed a sort of a way of figuring that out is going to be, we're going to have a sort of stewarding group of like, what do we want this to be collectively? So it's going to be people working in place, some of the trustees working together to sort of work that out. But then there's the other sort of side of it is, you know, if it continues to be the fact, like it was mentioned earlier on about sort of making these sort of mini foundations where the same sort of dynamics happen, the same processes are used, the same sort of mental models and concepts of what good looks like, how funding should work, what impact is, what sort of knowledge is used to say whether something's good or bad. You know, it's just going to keep going round in circles. Like the idea that if resources are the glacier at the top of the mountain, they flow down the mountain. If they keep flowing down the same way, they reach the same point. So they keep fertilizing the same part of the valley. It's going to take a different way of funding to fund different things. We can't use the same things as you know, just to say we're going to use this funding model and we're going to reach these people. It's not going to work like that. There's a different way of looking at what money is and how it works. Is going to be hopefully the sort of the legacy for this sort of sector, if you will. But again, that's not down to us. There's a lot of people saying, "What are you lot doing?" Which is fair enough.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate all your insights and thoughts on that. As we mentioned, we have been collecting a few questions throughout the session, so I'd want to just spend the last kind of 10 minutes jumping into them and exploring those. And I think the first one that came through is quite interesting. Can I understand how you built understanding with your board, Paul, to share their thinking on to shape their thinking on systems change approaches?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a really interesting question. So it's just been part of our whole governance sort of development, really. So when I first joined the trust, because of old historical reasons, we were only allowed 4 trustees. So we went through a constitutional change, which enabled us to open up the number of trustees on our board, and because we're so old, we had to get permission from the charity commission and everything. So anyway, after going through all of that process, we then, you know, and the existing board had been thinking about how can we do things differently anyway, and so we you know, we recruited trustees who were really interested in that as well, and coupled with, you know, the trustees that were already existing, there was a real sort of dissatisfaction with the status quo, and that I don't necessarily mean with Smallwood necessarily, though there was elements of that as well, but with society and how many women were in poverty, how the dial on that wasn't really changing and so on. And so that's what drove our kind of approach towards looking at a more kind of tackling the root causes of gendered poverty approach. And so the board have been as much in the driving seat on that as I have. And so it's been really, you know, we've had a really good synergy, if I can use that word, you know, for the executive team and the board. And so of course, everybody has slightly different opinions on how it should be approached, but there's been a real good alignment between, you know, the executive team and the board on that. And so it kind of naturally happened through that whole process of recruiting new trustees, you know, taking on board the existing trustees' ambitions, you know, a new executive and everything. So it all kind of aligned nicely, but also when we, during COVID as well, we gave out quite a lot of funding to really respond to all of the crises around COVID in terms of lack of funding for the sector, more women being pushed into poverty and so on. And while we'll continue to support and help immediate needs, it really accelerated our thinking about, well, actually, some of our funding also has to go into much longer term thinking and approaches and sort of systems change work as well as the immediate needs. So that all kind of came together sort of very organically, I would say. It wasn't certainly wasn't the executive making proposals to the board or anything like that. It was basically came together very naturally, you know, through our kind of general direction of travel and change that we were already on.
Thank you so much. I know that question was directed at yourself, Paul, but has anyone else got any thoughts on this that they want to kind of explore?
I think our sort of, we were very much an explicitly systems change funder for the last sort of 10 years. I think our sort of understanding of systems change has very much changed within that time frame, going by, you know, some of the things about power and stuff that's really helped, but understanding that systems as we were seeing them, we were looking at systems, the housing system, the prison system, which is really what we only took us ages to get to the point where, well, they're expressions of a different system. They exist in the way they exist because of systems of oppression that allow them to exist in that way. It took us a really long time to get to that level of understanding, which then made us sort of readjust about what our space, what our place in that space and other things that end in ACE were. So we had to have a really big readjustment, you know, and sort of linked back to the power point. The point about power, that it's all well and good us devolving decision making down to a group of people who formerly were excluded from decision making. That's a sort of a gesture that's really important. Unless you provide the facility to, if you give power, you can take it away. So it's always there as a sort of temporary zone, which isn't good for longevity, for feeling of sort of deep rootedness in something. So the other thing that we've had to do, which is, you know, been demanded of us, and sort of, you know, we've come to the conclusion as well, is to put the money for the places in Open Collective, for example. So it's there, it's not something they have to come and ask us for the money. We've set the budget together, here's the money. It's there, it's in Open Collective, it's yours to do with as the group has agreed how to dish it out. And I think that sort of the rhetoric around power sharing combined with the sort of practicalities of what that looks like, if the money is essentially like the power that foundations have is because of their money, if that money is then the transference of power, so it's a tandem track, I think that's really important.
I mean, we're at such an early stage of trying to look at what things are looking like in the future, so I don't think I can add anything to what Paul and Joe have said.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. So the final question here. This isn't targeted at anyone, so feel free to jump in. Whoever wants to have a go first. What investment are you putting into capacity building as a sustainability strategy? For example, empowering communities and partners to not be so reliant on you to raise funds.
I mean, I'd say part of this is the Anchors project that I described at City British Trust, giving an organisation unrestricted funding of £1 million for 10 years is key, because then they're not reliant on us for the funds. You've given them a good chunk of money to do that. However, any community intervention, any attempt to change the world we live in, to change the systems that oppress people, that make their lives misery, costs some amount of money or something in kind. So I remember running charities and having to be very creative on saying the same thing with different words to different funders at different times, because the need hadn't gone away and the system hadn't changed and the work still needed funding. So I think we can, and again, it's that element about power that Joe was talking about. It's so difficult, and we're in a difficult situation, I think, in community foundations to a certain degree, because as described earlier, we have so many different people inputting to that. Our role is to convene those philanthropists who wish to do something in a locality with those that they can support to get that work done. So I don't know quite how to answer that, and I'm now just waffling, so I'll be quiet.
Anyone else got any thoughts on that? Thank you very much, Dinah.
Yeah, so we're I haven't got, I'm just trying to think of a percentage, but I can't really think of an accurate one off the top of my head in terms of our funding. But we certainly, with our place-based work, and we've been funding a lot of coordination costs, spaces to meet, because if you're a small community organisation, it still costs money, doesn't it, to hire somewhere and all that kind of stuff. So bringing the leaders of those organisations together as well, so they can sort of network with each other. So we've been providing, and what's really worked in Coventry, where we've been the longest, is that we're funding a post which is actually called Partnership Connector, which they found it really a struggle to get funded up until that point. And the role of that person is to make sure that all the referral networks amongst all the different partners are running smoothly and engaging, and the relationships are all there. So it's been really, really a key post. So we've started funding more of those types of what I would call capacity building posts, as well as funding time and just space and for people to come together as well. And on a real practical basis, but we don't know whether it's our role or not to do this particular example I'm going to mention. But there's, as we all know, the infrastructure bodies themselves are really struggling with funding, like locally and nationally. So we've been trialing with some of our partners what we call power hours, where an individual from a community organisation will come to a consultant that we've paid for with an issue or a problem that they have in their organisation to help them think through. And that's also included HR issues as well, which can be very, very time consuming, and often smaller organisations might not have a person who has HR experience. So we've started trialing that a little bit to see whether there's a take up. But the thing with that is you only need that type of support when you need it. So it's really difficult to evaluate. So we've been piloting that, and we have so we still give out grants to individuals, but rather than Smallwood do it from our headquarters, we now do it through our community grant partners, as we call them. And so about £1 million a year is devolved from us to the grant partners, and they give out the individual grants to women in their communities. So it's their frontline workers who make the decisions on that. And as part of that model, we used to have so we would support an organisation for, say, £25,000 a year, and we'd give them a 20% administration fee as part of that. And in the last couple of years, we've moved to, you can more or less tell us what you need in terms of administration. But what's interesting is a lot of organisations still say, well, we don't want more than 20%. Because we want all the money to give out in grants ourselves. So and that's part of the dynamic thing, I think, that we were talking about earlier, where organisations don't feel they can ask for more overhead costs as well sometimes. So we're trying to sort of, carefully encourage them to apply for that when they when they need to. So so now some of those partners, we're funding like 30% overhead costs for those grants. And in Middlesbrough, the Middlesbrough programme, I would say about 50% of the overall budget is of about 300,000 is towards capacity building type initiatives.
Thanks, Paul. Joe, any thoughts on that before we wrap things up at all?
Sure, everybody needs a wee.
Of course. Thank you so much. I just, I think that's all we've got time for, unfortunately. Thank you for watching this webinar for the Prospectus Grant Series. And I just want to say thank you, a huge thank you again to the panel for taking the time to discuss this topic with us today. I hope those in attendance have found it as interesting and as fascinating as I found it. So please feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any further questions for the panel. And if you've enjoyed the session today, we do have a range of blogs and podcasts that cover grant making and philanthropy to check out as well. But again, thank you so much for joining, to the attendees, to the panel, and thank you so much for joining this conversation today.
Cheers all.
Thank you.